Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining and taking time out of your workday for our event today. My name is Rob Gorin, and I'm the president of HighRoll, Nextroll's Jewish Employee Resource Group. Thanks so much to the Nextroll leadership team for supporting our event today, especially Marius, Jason, and Toby, to our D&I program manager, Claudia, Christian and Kenny from our IT team, Abby from Workplace, as well as the entire HighRoll board, Jessica, Jess, Sam, Will, and Erez. Weeks ago, January 28th, marked International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This day is recognized by the United Nations in honor of the 6 million Jews and 11 million others murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators between 1941 and 1945. This year's remembrance marks 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, the largest concentration camp. This same month last year, I visited Auschwitz on a snowy winter day following a business trip to see our Media Mint team in Poland. Visiting Auschwitz was a painful and moving experience for me. I saw the train tracks where passengers arrived, unaware of their fate. Still preserved are thousands of shoes, glasses, suitcases, even strands of hair from victims who lost their lives. When telling a Polish acquaintance about my experience afterwards, she told me her feeling and a common attitude there about the Holocaust was not to dwell on it. I firmly believe this is wrong. I actually had a pretty visceral reaction when she said that. To create a better future, we must confront the past and learn from it. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, the resurgence of hatred in recent years, from violent extremism on places of worship, shows that anti-Semitism, other forms of religious bigotry, racism, and prejudice are sadly still very much with us. Although the Holocaust may seem like a long time ago, it happened in our grandparents' or parents' lifetimes, not in distant history. We are the last generation to be able to hear firsthand testimony from Holocaust survivors, lessons we must pass on to our children and grandchildren for generations to come. We are very lucky to have with us today Mr. George Elbaum to share his story of survival and resilience. Dr. Elbaum earned a PhD from MIT in nuclear physics and had an extremely successful career in the aerospace industry and international business. For 60 years, he didn't talk about the Holocaust or his childhood. After watching a documentary called Paperclips about an 8th grade project to understand the Holocaust, he was inspired to share his story. In the past decade, he has given more than 250 talks to groups around the world. We are very lucky to have him here at Nextroll, which is his first time speaking for an office group. Thanks so much for coming. Without further ado, Mr. George Elbaum.
Rob, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to tell you about the world I was born into, a dangerous world that I survived, but only because of major luck, in a world that I hope none of you ever have to experience. Place, Warsaw, Poland. The time, September 1939. Hitler's Nazi armies invade Poland, and that starts World War II. Hundreds of airplanes, thousands of tanks, 1 million troops. The Nazi army sweeps across Poland and conquers it in 1 month. Then they hold a victory parade on the streets of Warsaw, and even Hitler himself comes to view it. That's Hitler with his arm outstretched. Now, I was born in Warsaw. I lived there at the time, but I don't remember this because I was only 1 year old. But I remember most things since I was 3. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, I had a family of 12 people, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Within 3 years, out of the 12 people, only my mother and I were still alive. The other 10 were all dead, murdered by the Nazis. Why? Because they were Jewish. As I'm sure you know, the stated goal of the Nazi Party was to exterminate everyone who they considered undesirable. Jews were on top of the list, but there were others, gypsies, invalids, gays, handicapped people, socialists, but Jews were on top of the list, and the largest group. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, there was about 3.5 million Jews living in the country. At the end of the war, 5 years later, 90% of them, 9 out of every 10, were dead, murdered by the Nazis. What became known as the Holocaust is the murder of 6 million Jews during the 5 years of the war. Now, 6 million is a huge number. I don't think it's a human number. I can't feel it, and I don't think many of you can either. So I'm going to try to put it into more human terms. For the moment, I just talk about averages. 6 million murdered in 5 years. That averages to 1,200,000 every year or 100,000 every month. That's still a huge number. But if you consider San Francisco, population about 800,000, that means the Nazis killed as many Jews every 8 months as every man, woman, and child in San Francisco. Or look at another way, they essentially, 6 million is equivalent to 7.5 cities the size of San Francisco. There's never been a murder to that extent in the history of the world. Even Genghis Khan was a patsy when it comes to compared to Hitler. In addition, question, of course, is why did the Nazis do it? The answer is anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews. But anti-Semitism is just like all the other antis, whether it's anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-black, anti-white, anti-gay. Hatred for someone, not because they've ever done anything to you, but because they're different. Maybe a different color skin, maybe a different way of worshiping God, just different. And all the antis are always, always negative, and they always end in destruction. I speak mostly to high schools, and I tell the students that if you want to do anything good in your life, you have to be for things, not against things. That we all have to be for things rather than against things. In addition to the cruelty and inhumanity of murder of that industrial scale, you can also ask yourself, how is it possible to do this? How is it possible to kill every man, woman, child in San Francisco every 8 months and keep repeating it over and over again for 5 years? Well, the Nazis were very efficient when it came at least to the process of murder. And the way they did was they started by establishing what became known as the ghettos. In each of the countries they conquered, they chose 1 or 2 or 3 major cities where there was already a large Jewish population. And they focused on, you might say, the Jewish quarter, the center of the Jewish life in that city. And they established what became known as the ghetto. I would just be talking about the Warsaw Ghetto. I was born there, I lived there, I remember that. And that was by far the largest ghetto of all. So in Warsaw, the Nazis chose about 2% of the area of Warsaw to establish the ghetto. Jewish population was 30%, but they only took 2%. They built a wall around it, a brick wall with barbed wire on top, with gates that were guarded by soldiers with machine guns and dogs. And once the wall was up, they collected Jews from the other 98% of Warsaw from outside the walls, which is about 80 or 90% lived outside the walls. And they forced them all into this small walled-in ghetto where my family lived, where I lived, the child. And then the Nazis swept the rest of the countryside, the whole Warsaw region, for the smaller towns and villages, and even smaller cities in the whole Warsaw region. And some of them have Jewish population also of 20 and 30 and even 50%. And I know that because over the last 5 years, I've been going back to Poland, speaking to high schools there. And I've spoken in many of these smaller towns that had Jewish populations also of 30, 40, 50%. Now it's zero. So once the Nazis swept the whole Warsaw region and forced everybody into the ghetto, they started taking people out of the ghetto, putting them on trains and shipping them to concentration camps. And most of them, gas chambers. One thing before we go further, imagine what happens when you have an area in San Francisco where there's 100,000 people living in it. And then you build a wall around it, and then you take the other 700,000 that live around there outside the wall, and you force them in. What are the people who are being forced in? Where do they live? Well, there's only room for the people who are already living there. That's exactly what happened in Warsaw. And I remember I was about 3 years old. Suddenly there's like a dozen strangers moved into the apartment, which at that time only my mother, my grandmother, and I were there. The men had already been taken away by the Nazis, and they were all dead, but we didn't know about it until after the war. So these strangers, they were sleeping on the couches, on the floor, in the kitchen, in the hallway. And I remember asking my mother, who are these people? What are they doing here? And my mom said, well, they're friends. They'll be with us for a little while. They were with us for a while, whatever that might mean to a 3-year-old. But once the Nazis were satisfied, they collected all the Jews from the whole Warsaw region and the city and forced them all into the ghetto. Then they started taking people out, shipping them to concentration camps. Rather than telling you how that was done, I'll read to you a chapter from a book that I wrote 9-10 years ago. It's called Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows. And if we have time, I can tell you that it was a small middle school in a small town in Tennessee that inspired me to write this book after I was silent about my Holocaust childhood for 60-some years. The chapter I'm going to read to you is called Umschlagplatz, which in German means shipping point or collection point. Now, the first time I heard that word was when I was 4 years old. I'm 81 now, so that was 77 years ago. I've never forgotten that word. Suddenly there was loud shouting coming from the courtyard. Then the entire apartment complex was filled with ear-splitting noise. Shouts, screams, doors banging everywhere, and heavy running footsteps. My grandmother ran into the room holding my coat, grabbed my hand, and led me to the staircase, filled with people, all going downstairs. When we reached the courtyard, it was already full of people, crowded together in groups, with soldiers in dark green uniforms, shouting orders and walking between the groups. My grandmother held my hand tightly as we were pushed back and forth by the crowd. Till finally we were standing at the edge of our group, facing a large arched entry gate that led from the street into our courtyard. It seemed that we stood there a long, long time. I recall being glad that my grandmother put my coat on because I was getting cold. And I remember seeing some groups being led by soldiers out of the courtyard through the big gate. Exactly what you see there. You see the gate in the back. People are being led out and they're guarded by soldiers with machine guns. Then suddenly I saw my mother running in through the gate, holding a piece of paper in her hand, showing the paper to some soldiers, talking with them, and finally coming to us, my grandmother and me, and leading us out of the courtyard. It was only years later, after the war, did I understand what happened. The Nazis were emptying out the Warsaw Ghetto, apartment block at a time, and shipping the residents to concentration camps. My mother, who at that time was working at a factory in the ghetto, which the Nazis authorized the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to manage and make uniforms for the Nazi army, my mother somehow learned that our apartment block was being emptied out that day. She got from her factory director an official document allowing her to keep her family in place. With this document, in effect, a temporary permit to continue living. Think about that. That little piece of paper was a temporary permit for my grandmother and me and herself to continue living. With this document, she managed to convince the Nazi officer commanding that day's sweep to let us go. Had she arrived a few minutes later, it would have been too late, because if she arrived a few minutes later, my fate would have been like the little boy that you see over there. Because from here, these people were taken directly to freight yards, put onto freight cars, cattle cars, and shipped directly to concentration camps. And all children, most women, and all the older or weaker men would be almost immediately sent to the gas chambers. So my mom hadn't come, and then I wouldn't be here with you guys today. Pure luck. I mentioned that if people were lucky, they would move in with friends. Well, what if they weren't lucky? What if they didn't know anybody? They would have to live on the street. And Warsaw is a northern city, like New York, Toronto, Seattle. During the winter, it's cold, ice. And because of that, during the 2.5 years of the ghetto's existence, 80,000 people died, many of them right on the street. They died from the cold, they died from starvation, they died from disease. And I remember particular winter times, I would hear in the morning clang, 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 the sound of a wooden wagon that was being pulled over the cobblestone streets of the ghetto. It was pulled by men that would collect bodies of people who died on the street and taking the bodies out. The ghetto was not a good place to live. It was not a good place to die. Here's a couple of kids freezing, begging for food. There was no food to be given. We were all starving. What happened next? My mom was a very smart woman. She realized sooner than most people that the days of the ghetto and everybody in it were numbered. So she decided to try to get us to safety, where there was still a chance to escape. And the first place in our flight to safety is a place I call the Shed. And I'll read to you part of a chapter called The Shed. And the reason I put it on the cover of my book is had a major effect on my life, on my professional life as an adult. The Shed. We can only speak in whispers here, my grandmother told me. We were now in a large shed with corrugated metal walls and ceiling, pieces of rusting metal equipment strewn about, and our bags and blankets on the floor. Several families were here with us, but no one did I recognize, all with suitcases and bags and blankets. One family even had a little black dachshund, and its owners told us that it never barks. I petted his soft fur and I played with him. Some of the people played cards, some knitted, but no one spoke except in very quiet whispers. My grandmother took some bread and sausage from her bag, made tea on a little chemical burner, and that was our dinner. When it got dark, no one lit any candles. We wrapped ourselves in our blankets and we slept. I woke up in the morning and I wanted to play with the little black dachshund, but it was gone. So I asked its owners, where is it? And their only answer to me was, it's gone. Years later, my mother told me that during the night, its owners had to choke it to death to keep it from barking outside at footsteps outside the shed. If you have a small pet, can you imagine choking it to death in your own lap? I can't. The day, or perhaps many days, went by very slowly in the near silence, the only sounds coming from outside the shed. There was a big hole in the shed's roof through which I watched white clouds on the blue sky. At one time, I saw an airplane with black crosses flying across the sky, exactly what you see there. That's a scene I remember from the shed. At that time, I didn't know that it was a Nazi airplane, and the black crosses were Nazi insignia. It just looked so beautiful to me against the blue sky. It wasn't constrained in a dark shed as I was. And I felt strangely drawn to it. I wanted to be in it. I wanted to be somehow with it. I never lost that feeling and interest in airplanes. A few years later, after the war, I would read Polish aviation magazines. Later on, in high school in Oregon, after we moved to the United States, I would build and fly model airplanes. In college, I majored in aeronautical engineering, took flying lessons, got a private pilot's license, crashed an airplane, and walked away without a scratch. And then for 25 years, I flew hang gliders in Southern California, crashed half a dozen times, walked away from all but the last one. And on that one, I crashed at the top of a mountain. I woke up 6 hours later in a hospital. And for my next birthday, my wife gave me a video taken from a newsreel helicopter showing a rescue helicopter lifting me unconscious from the top of the hill. And my wife tells me to watch that movie whenever I get too cocky. She's right. However, I've never forgotten that airplane against the blue sky through the hole in the roof and the feeling of awe and exhilaration that it gave me. That's why I put it on the cover of my book. What happened next? My mom put my grandmother into what she thought was a safe hiding place. Paid a lot of money to put her in there, all the money she had. Turns out it wasn't, but we only learned that after the war. So thinking that my grandmother was safe, my mom smuggled herself and me out of the ghetto. What happened next? Enough information and news, including some eyewitnesses, managed to smuggle themselves back into the ghetto to warn everyone about what was happening with the people who were being shipped out, that most of them were dying in gas chambers. So a group of young civilians, several hundred of them, decided that they knew they would die. They knew they had no chance of escaping. So they decided they would rather die fighting than die the gas chambers. So imagine a group of young civilians, your age, younger, older, no military training. They had some rifles and some pistols hidden in the ghetto. They rose up against a trained Nazi army with thousands of troops, with artillery and tanks and airplanes. The ghetto fighters knew they had no chance. They knew it was a hopeless act of defiance. They fought for about 2 or 3 weeks and they all died. And here's a photograph Every man, woman, and child who remained in the ghetto was dead, every one of them. And Hitler ordered his army to destroy every building within the ghetto. And this is a panoramic shot of the ghetto right after the uprising. It lasted about 2 or 3 weeks only. But every building was in ruins. The black line that you see back there, these are the buildings of Warsaw outside the walls of the ghetto. How did my mom and I survive outside the ghetto? Here's a photo of my mom when she was 7 years old with her brother. It's the only photo that she managed to keep of herself and anybody with her family, because she kept it under her blouse all 5 years of the war. My mom was a very smart woman. She was a young attorney before the war. At the university, she learned English and she learned French. So the first thing she did when she got herself and me out of the ghetto, she dyed her black hair blonde so she wouldn't look quite so Jewish. Then she bought the identification papers of a young Polish Catholic woman who died and took on that woman's name. The woman's name was Śliwowska, the Polish name. And the next time my mom saw me, because I didn't live with her once we were out of the ghetto, she told me, from now on, forget Elbaum. Your name is no longer Elbaum. It's a Jewish name. Forget Elbaum. From now on, your name is Śliwowski. And every time my mom would buy a new set of ID papers to keep the Nazis off her trail, she would always, next time she would see me, she would tell me what my new name was. I had about 4 or 5 different last names, and I had to remember each one of them. So with fake ID papers with blonde hair, my mom went to work. First, she had some good jobs. She became an English governess or French governess to wealthy Poles who wanted their kids to learn those languages. When these jobs ran out, my mom took on whatever was available. She became a cook, a maid, a scrub woman, a laundress, whatever, as long as the job came with 2 benefits. Number 1, oops, do you know what? Yeah, never mind. Okay. Number 1, they needed to have a room and board in the apartment of the people that hired her. And the reason that was critical is that she wouldn't have to walk to work back and forth every day, because every time she was on the street, she could be picked up by Nazi patrol and sent to concentration camp, fake papers or not. Requirement number 2, a little bit of cash. Not for herself, but to pay to the people who are keeping me. Because my mom decided that I'll be safer if I was raised by Polish Catholic families together with their kids. Tells me that when I was throughout the war, 4 and 5 and 6 years old, my hair was light brown, so I didn't look Jewish. It was only after the war, within the first 2 years after the war, that it went from light brown to dark brown to black, like hers. Then when I speak to high school, I tell them, then about 10, 15 years ago, it turned light again. I tell them if they don't know how it happens, to ask the grandparents. So my mom survived by luck, strength, and wits. Survived by luck only, and I'll give an example of my luck. I remember I was sitting I was probably one of the first, or maybe one of the first families with whom I was living. I was sitting at a table eating soup. It must have been evening because somebody was lighting a kerosene lamp on the table. There was no electricity in that part of Warsaw at the time, apparently. So I'm sitting there eating soup. And all of a sudden, there's loud banging at the front door and loud shouts in German, and everybody rushed to the front door. But I didn't. I just continued to sit there and eat soup because I was hungry. I was hungry through most of the war years, but that was not unusual. There was not enough food in Poland during the war, so a lot of people were hungry. And because I was kept by other families, I was hungry much of the time. So I'm sitting there eating soup, ignoring the commotion that's in the back of me at the front door. But all of a sudden, I sensed that somebody was staring at me. I remember I turned to the side like this, and there was a tall Nazi soldier standing there, staring straight down at me. I remember he had on this heavy, dark green coat, so it must have been wintertime. And on his shoulder, he has a large weapon, like a rifle, but a much bigger barrel with holes. Now I know it was a machine gun, but that was the very first time I've ever seen one. And apparently, even at the age of 4, machinery interested me. So that's probably why I became an engineer. I just kept staring at his gun and staring at it. But then I looked at him, and I smiled at him. I still remember that. I smiled at him. And then I continued to eat soup. He stood there another moment or two, probably trying to decide what to do about me. And then he moved on, and soon he and the soldiers were gone, and all was quiet. I learned after the war that had I shown any fear whatsoever, it would have made me drop my pants to see whether I was circumcised. because only Jews were circumcised in Poland at that time. And if that had happened, I would have never reached my 5th birthday. So once again, pure luck. I lived with about 4 or 5 different Polish Catholic families. My mom would move me from one to the next whenever the family with whom I was living alerted her to danger to me and danger to them. And the reason for that was that in Poland, the Nazis decreed that any Poles who were hiding Jews, including little kids like me, would be immediately sent to concentration camps along with the Jews that were hiding. So I want to ask you a challenge question. I'd like you to think about it, and answer it honestly, but answer it only to yourself, not to anybody else. Imagine that whoever you're working for now or later, they say that they have a foreign office and they send you to that foreign office. It's a big promotion. It's a big promotion. You accept it. So you'd be there a year or two, but it's very professional. It's worth doing. So you go there. When you get there, you find out that the government of that country is prejudiced against a small minority. They are arresting them, throwing them in jails, beating them, killing them. And you know that they're innocent. The government just prejudiced. And you know that you could save one person. Maybe a little 4-year-old skinny, undernourished kid as I was at the time. If you took him or her into your house or apartment. But you might be risking maybe your life. Would you do it? Would you do it? Answer that only to yourself. But the 4 or 5 different families that took me, they took that risk. That is the only reason I'm here with you today, because they took that risk. They weren't doing it for the little bit of pittance that my mom could pay them. She paid them all the cash she was making. They did it because they thought it was the right thing to do. They saved me. The last family with whom I lived was headed by a man named Leon. And his is the only name I remember, just his first name. I don't remember any of the other names. It's probably because I liked him. He was always fair to me. He was kind most of the time. But he was also tough. And whenever I disobeyed him, he beat me, whipped me. And it hurt. It hurt. But I always knew what I had done. And if it involved eating some food because I was really hungry and I was alone in the apartment, I was told not to touch it. Sometimes it was worth it eating. So I liked Leon. I didn't like his wife or their little daughter, maybe a year younger than I, because whenever my mom would visit me, that might be once a month, every several months. Last time I didn't see her for 6 months. My mom would bring me a present. It might be a little wooden toy, or it might be a hard-boiled egg, which was a nice present in wartime Poland, where almost everybody was hungry. My mom always made sure that I ate the egg before she would leave the apartment. But after my mom would leave, Leon's wife very often took away the little toy and gave it to their daughter to play with, so I didn't like them. I was with Leon from the beginning of 1944 through the end of that year, and that included the Warsaw Uprising in August 44. Warsaw Uprising differed in one very fundamental way from the Ghetto Uprising 16 months earlier, because the Ghetto Uprising was in April 43, and the fighters knew that they would all die. It was truly a hopeless act of defiance. The Warsaw fighters in August 44 thought they had a chance. First of all, they were loyal to and supported by the Polish government in exile in London. So they had some weapons. They had some mortars, machine guns, ammunition that were airdropped to them by the Royal Air Force. But the main reason they thought they had a chance was by August 44, the Russian army had already pushed the Nazis out of Russia and out of eastern Poland. And the Russian army was sitting right across the river that cuts through Warsaw, right on the other side of the river. The expectation was that once the uprising started, the Russians would cross the river, help the fighters liberate Warsaw sooner, liberate Poland sooner, end the war sooner. That was actually even expected because Moscow radio was encouraging the fighters to do that. But that was a huge lie and a huge fake out on the part of the Russians. They had no intention of helping. Russians decided long before that every country they liberate from the Nazis, they would turn it into a communist satellite. So the last thing they wanted in Warsaw or in Poland would be to have a Polish underground loyal to the pro-Western government in London, still armed, resisting the communist takeover. So the Russian army sat across the river, did absolutely nothing. They watched and they waited while the Nazis killed off most of those 20,000 fighters and turned Warsaw into a total ruin. This is what Warsaw looked like at October, November of 44. It was a total ruin. How did Leon and his family and I get out of there in time? Apparently, Leon must have gotten wind that the uprising was about to begin. So he somehow got a pedal-powered rickshaw. And the morning of the uprising, he and his wife had packed some boxes and suitcases. We loaded them all on this pedal-powered rickshaw. And with his wife and daughter and I sitting on the baggage and him pedaling, we left the city. Eventually, we stopped to rest when we were out in the countryside in farmlands. And I asked him where we were going. He said, well, we're going to my cousin's farm. I wandered away along a ditch that ran beside the road. And all of a sudden, I saw this dark blue object, kind of like a large potato lying in the grass. I picked it up. It felt cold and heavy like metal. And I started to play with it. I noticed it had a shiny ring on one end. So I pulled on the ring, and it came out in my hand just as Leon called that we're leaving. I tossed the object over my shoulder, and it fell in the ditch, and I ran to the rickshaw. As I jumped onto the rickshaw, big explosion from where I had just been, and Leon started pedaling furiously, much faster than before. It was only later that I learned that was a German hand grenade. Whereas Leon didn't know what I had done, he did know that with the uprising now in Warsaw, any Poles found by the Nazis and their weapons or explosives would have been shot on the spot. But double luck. If Leon had called me a few seconds later, a grenade would have exploded in my hand. And if there had been any Nazi troops anywhere in the vicinity, they would have tried to find us if they heard the explosion, and they would have shot all of us. So double luck. I was with Leon through the end of that year on that farm. And in January, right after New Year, suddenly my mother appeared. How she found me, I have no idea, because there was no public communication in the Warsaw region after the uprising. I had not seen her for 6 months, so I didn't know when or even whether I would ever see her again. So that was probably the happiest moment of my childhood, seeing her alive. About a week later, I was sleeping. She woke me up, and she had tears in her eyes, and she said to me, "You are saved." And I didn't know what she was talking about. She took my hand, pulled me out of bed, and dragged me behind her. We were going to the main room of the farmhouse. And when we got there, there were some soldiers there, but they didn't have the dark green uniforms. They had olive uniforms. And my mom bent down to me and said, "They're Russian." That didn't mean anything to me. But when the Russian officer saw me, I was the only little kid in the room. He reached into his pocket and took out a little white cube, and he handed it to me like this. But I didn't know what it was. So my mom said, "That's sugar. Take it. Taste it." So I put it in my mouth, and I swear it was the best taste I have ever had my whole life to this day. And I call that moment the sugar cube miracle, because ever since that moment, I got a tremendous sweet tooth. I can start dinner with dessert, have dessert for the main course, and end it with dessert. And I'd love to do it, except my wife never lets me. I know she's right. About a week or so after the sugar cube miracle, we learned that the Russians had already pushed the Nazis out of Warsaw. So my mom and I returned to Warsaw, mostly by walking, so occasionally hitching a ride on a military truck. And when we came, Warsaw looked like this, except there was a lot of snow. And I remember as we were walking through it, occasionally here and there, I would see a body half buried in the snow, still left over from the battle between the Russians and the Nazis. My mom almost immediately got a job, because she had been an attorney, a job with a brand new book publishing organization that the Polish communist government started to print books and propaganda. And her job was to go around the country and set up bookstores, because most bookstores were closed in the countryside, in smaller towns, cities during the war. Since there was no public transport right after the war that was reliable, my mom was given a car and a driver. She didn't drive. It was sort of a car. It was a little old three-wheeler, one little wheel in front like this, two little wheels in the back. Her driver was given a machine gun. She was given a pistol. And the reason for that was that whereas in the Warsaw region, The Nazis had wiped out most of the Polish underground. The further out regions where they would have to travel occasionally to set up bookstores, there still were pockets of pro-Western underground resisting the communist takeover. And they knew that only the government owned cars. They would attack cars on the road. My mom and her driver were lucky and they never needed to use their weapons. About a week or two after the Sugar Cube miracle, we learned that the Russians had already pushed the Nazis out of Warsaw. So I talked about that, okay. This is a photo of my mom and me. We're in a Jeep, which means the little three-wheeler must have died. I'll read to you part of a chapter called Summer 1945, Returning Prisoners. Several times during those early months after the war, my mom and I went to the railway station on news of trains arriving from Russia, carrying Polish prisoners from the Eastern Front. My father, an attorney and a reserve officer before the war, was called to active duty during the war's first few days, and he was sent to the Eastern Front. And my mother hoped that he had been taken prisoner by the Russians and would be returning from Russia on one of these trains. My mom was understandably filled with hope and anticipation as we waited for these trains to arrive at the station. But for me, it was a strange and an unsettling mix of expectation and concern. On the one hand, I wanted a father in my life. I was quietly envious of children like Leon's daughter, who had a father. On the other hand, I had no memories of my own father, as I was only a year old when he left for the front and never returned. So the trains for which we were waiting might bring a total stranger who would enter our life, and I could only hope that I would like him and that he would like me. Together with a lot of other people, we would stand at the station's entrance and watch as the gaunt and bedraggled men filed out slowly and wearily. They were gaunt and bedraggled because they've been prisoners in Russia for years. Sometimes there were joyous shouts as the waiting and hopeful spotted one of their own, followed by much embracing and tears of happiness. Mostly, however, the arriving men shuffled by ungreeted, perhaps because they were not from Warsaw and had to travel further to find their families, or perhaps because there were no survivors and their families to greet them. My mother was always quiet when we left the station after finding no one. We would walk home in total silence. That was a very happy time for me when I was with my mom in Warsaw, because I thought my mom would never again park me with some strangers. But that's not what happened, because 2 years after the war ended, like early 1947, my mom put me on a train with a group of other Jewish orphans or half-orphans. We were going by train to France. In France, we would board ship and sail to Palestine. Not Israel, because Israel wasn't founded yet for another year and a half. So that was, in a way, it was like a kinder transport. I never asked my mom why was she sending me, but I did some research when I was writing my book. I guess the question occurred to me only when I was writing the book, which was about 10 years ago. And I realized that I learned that there were pogroms in a number of smaller towns and villages in Poland. Several hundred Jews were killed by Polish mobs. So my mom was presumably sending me for my safety and would hope to someday find me in Palestine. Strange piece of luck. I was lucky, and one evening, a couple of us were roughhousing. I tripped, fell, and I had tremendous pain in my leg. Broke my leg. I thought they were going to cut it off because I saw so many people without arms or legs. Right after the war, I was sure they were going to cut my leg off, but took me to the hospital and put a cast on my leg and assured me they were not going to cut it off. I was a very happy little 8-year-old. This is my passport photo for that trip. I was 8 years old for that trip to France. But because I had a cast on my leg and the ship was going to run the British blockade of Palestine, they sent me back to my mom. The rest of the camp went off to Palestine. But 2 years later, I'm back in France with my mom. My mom did such a good job setting up bookstores throughout Poland that the Polish communist government sent her to France to set up Polish bookstores for the Polish immigrant community. to try to entice him to come back. After 6 months, my mom set up a number of bookstores. After 6 months, she defected, went to the American embassy, applied for a visa for herself and for me. Her visa came through right away. So my mom came to America in September. My visa didn't. So once again, she had to find a couple of strangers. It was a Polish-French couple. Lived with them for a couple of months. During the days, I would wander all around Paris, ride the metro. Picked up enough French so that whenever I got lost, I could ask somebody in French, how do I get home? And they would answer me in French. I always got home, luckily. But eventually, my visa came through, and on the 1st of December, 1949, Polish-French couple put me on an airplane in Paris. My mom met me in New York. About a week or two later, we took a train down to a small town in North Carolina called Cove City, 1,000 population, tiny place. When the year turned, first week of January, school opened. My mom right away put me into 6th grade. The only problem was that I didn't speak a word of English, and nobody there spoke Polish. But my mom thought that'd be the best way for me to quickly learn how to speak English, and she was right. Because by the time we left Cove City and moved to Oregon, I was already fluent in English. It was only a year and a half, so half of 6th grade and 7th grade. The surprising thing to me is that everybody there had a heavy Southern accent. I never picked it up. And my only explanation to myself is that my Polish accent was so heavy that it kind of kept the Southern accent away. My wife used to be a speech therapist. She tells me I'm wrong, but but I don't want to admit that. Anyway, the other big problem was that before I really even knew what the kids were talking about, I made some really good social, very funny social mistakes. If we have time, ask me about trying to learn baseball, because that was both the most embarrassing but also the funniest. Anyway, we moved to Oregon, a small town called Forest Grove, about 5,000 population, 30 miles from Portland. This was summer of 1951. My mom right away took me for an interview with the school principal. He tested me, both for my language and my knowledge, and he allowed me to skip 8th grade and start as a freshman. Freshman year was very tough on me. First of all, I was only a year and a half in America. So, I still didn't know social customs, and I did some embarrassing social mistakes. Not as bad as North Carolina, but still, when I realized I was embarrassed a lot of time, and I was 13 years old, so I got embarrassed very easily. Next, I was the only kid in school with an accent, and that was embarrassing. Number 3, I started to stutter badly, very badly. I think it's because the memories of the Holocaust started impinging in my head. 4 years later, when I graduated, lost most of my Polish accent, lost most of my stuttering. During the summers, I did everything kids do, they picked strawberries and beans in the summers, and I did that too. I never made much money picking strawberries because I loved them, so I was eating too many of them. Later on, the last 2 summers when I lived there, I worked in sawmills, made better pocket money. In my senior year, I went to my math teacher, and I asked him what is a good college for aeronautical engineering, because ever since then, I wanted to do something with airplanes. And he said, well, the best is MIT. Never heard of MIT. Was very naive, stupid, depending on your viewpoint. My viewpoint is stupid. And it was the only school I applied to. But I was also lucky, and I got in. And that's why I wound up spending 8.5 years at MIT in 3 phases. I got a bachelor's after the first 4 years, got a couple of masters after the next year and a half, and I got a PhD after the next 3. I worked in the aerospace industry, both when I was still at MIT and in between and at the end. My most memorable job was with Space Technology Labs, or TRW Systems. I was on the team that designed the variable thrust rocket engine, which lowered our Apollo astronauts to the surface of the moon. It's called the Lunar Excursion Module rocket engine. That was a great job. Then for 25 years, I commuted between California and Moscow, representing American companies in Russia. I learned Russian by going cross-country skiing with them and drinking a lot of vodka, and I hate vodka. But for all those 50 years, I kept the Holocaust at an emotional distance. I never wanted to see Holocaust movies. I didn't want to read any books about the Holocaust because I saw what it did to my mom, who was a very successful businesswoman in America, but she was haunted by the Holocaust till her dying day, which was 15 years ago. She died at the age of 91, and I didn't want that to happen. So very few people knew about my background. And then 9.5 years ago, I had this realization by seeing this movie, Paperclips, that my story had value. And when she rented that movie, because she assured me it didn't have any scenes from the Holocaust, I don't want to see that stuff. But when it ended, she asked me for maybe the 20th time whether I would reconsider and write a book. I surprised myself. I surprised her. I told her I'll do it. I started the next day, finished writing it 3 months later. So that was like March of 2010. I immediately put it on a free access website. Scribe.com, it's a California company, a San Francisco company. So I put it immediately. I didn't want to sell it. I wanted people to read it. But again, friends have asked me to put it on Amazon. So it is on Amazon, but it's free on Scribe.com. And I thought I was finished. I wrote a book. I'm all finished. Well, my best friend at MIT knew that I was writing the book. He told the head of MIT, Hillel, about it. And that was like late March. And she had planned to, on the 10th of April, 2010, to have an event. This was Holocaust Remembrance Day. And at the Boston Downtown Memorial, she asked me to come in and speak at it. First reaction was hell no, because I was afraid. I don't want to get in front of public, talk about something that still pains. But I already had tickets to go to Boston because I'm on a number of MIT committees. I was then. I'm still on the committees now. So I was already planning to go to Boston. So I had no excuse other than cowardice. And I wasn't going to allow myself that luxury. So I practiced and practiced and practiced. And I thought, okay, I got it down pat. Then the speaker, I was the last speaker, and the speaker before me talked about a situation in the Warsaw Ghetto that I knew nothing about before. When I heard that, I choked. And then she said, okay, George, it's your turn. Choking. I kept choking and choking. And I kept speaking. But enough people came up to me afterwards and said, you got to keep doing this. So I've done this now over 250 times. And the only reason I know the number is that I was interviewed by a newspaper reporter, and before I started talking to high schools, and she suggested I get a website. So I do have one. It's neitheryesterdays.com, and each one of my talks is there with photographs, with the questions that the students ask and my answers. And every time I put a new post on, it tells me the number. That's why I know this is 253, I think. So 90% high schools. I speak occasionally to adults, and this is one of these occasions. I speak in colleges, and I'll give you an example of what happened. I was asked to speak at the Berkeley's Haas Business School to their leadership course. That was right after that attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh where 11 people were killed. And they asked me to come in, and I spoke with them, with them. And the one question that they asked me afterwards in many different ways was, how can we as individuals do anything to fight intolerance and anti-Semitism and racism? And I told them 2 ways. Number one, speak up. Prejudice and intolerance grows when no one tries to stop it or silence it. So speak up when you see situations. Take some courage. But you got to say, hey, would you repeat that? I want to hear that again. I want my friends to hear it too. So speak up when you see examples of intolerance and racism. And number two, support leaders, civic leaders or political leaders who do the same, who also openly fight intolerance and anti-Semitism, as opposed to our president who, after the Charlottesville was an open anti-Semitic march, and his answer was, well, there are good people and there are very fine people on both sides. When it comes to intolerance and hate, there are no fine people on the side of hate. They only find people on the side of tolerance, fairness. I was surprised in March of 2016. This is when the political campaign, presidential campaign just started. I've been speaking to schools and they always ask me questions about the Holocaust, about my survival, about my family. How did you meet your wife? But the first time ever I was asked a political question was in March 2016. And it was a small high school in the southern part of San Francisco. And students said, does Trump's campaign remind you of Hitler's campaign in the 1930s? And I said, yes. First, demonize the press, fake news. Next, demonize the judiciary, so-called judge. Next, demonize the other immigrants, rapists, criminals. Exactly what Hitler did in Germany. Since then, I've had that question asked of me over and over again as the campaign progressed and certainly after election. And that included even worse, more violent questions, such as about a year ago within this area, a very good private school, a blonde, blue-eyed girl, clearly not a Muslim, came up to me afterwards. She says, do you think there's a chance of genocide against Muslims in America? Answer that. But after the election, I decided that enough fearful questions, whether it's from immigrants in Silicon Valley or people in Boston or Seattle, I get asked a lot of questions that are political. And I want to be there to answer them. So I decided to double the number of talks. So I used to do like 24 a year. Since 2016, I've been doing 4 dozen. Last 2019, I did 60. And I'll probably do the same now. So why am I here? Exactly to urge you, or to first of all, to stand up to any action of anti-Semitism, anti-racism, intolerance that you see. Build up the courage and speak up, and also to support those leaders that also openly vow to fight intolerance. Very much hope you do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. We're going to take some questions at the end. But first, let's see if anyone at our remote offices who's listening in has questions. Are we able to do that with the IT side to get Salt Lake City or New York to ask questions, or should we have them ping them to us? Okay, sounds good. So we'll start with San Francisco questions and then come back to me, and any questions from the other offices I'll ask.
So, questions. Got to tell you that in high schools particularly, getting the first question is the toughest. The bravest person in the room that asks the first questions. So who's going to be? Yes, hey, good, congratulations. Yep.
The story is that a lot of German engineers were brought to the United States after the war to work on rockets in our space race. Curious if you interacted with him and how that, given your recent history, what sort of feelings and challenges that had for you?
I welcome that question because the answer is yes. In my first job, I started specializing in rocket engine design. And my office mate was a German engineer who came over together with Werner von Braun. He had worked in Peenemünde designing rockets, engines for the V2. We never talked about the Holocaust. We never talked about the war. He was a pilot, so he and I actually flew his plane together. We even flew his sailplane together. Everything was fine until you. And again, we were both lucky because his airplane fell apart, and lucky. No, that's another story. But for whatever reason, I think it must have been the anniversary of either the fire raid on Hamburg or Dresden, one or the other, where this is where a fleet of like 1,000 of Allied bombers came in and dropped incendiary bombs on those cities, and several 100,000 civilians were killed in this firestorm that went through the cities. And he turned to me all of a sudden. We're talking about something else, and he said, the bombing, I forgot it was Dresden or Frankfurt, but he said that was the worst atrocity during the whole war. And I was stunned. He just came out, blurted it out. I said to him, well, what about the Holocaust? What about the millions of people that were killed by the Nazis in concentration camps? He said, well, that's a different story, or a different issue. I went to the management and I said to them, you get him out of my office or get me out of his office. I don't ever want to be in the same room with him again. He was an unrepentant Nazi. I've had German friends with whom I went to grad school together. That doesn't bother me. I still react negatively when I hear German. That's just a gut thing. But I had a good friend from Germany. But when somebody's unrepentant, I can't stand that.
We have a question here from our New York office, sent over virtually. The question is, first and foremost, thank you for taking the time to paint this vivid picture of you and your family's struggles. What do you feel we can do more of to create remembrance outside of just the official days of remembrance?
Well, I guess I'm no longer much about events, about holidays, about birthdays, whatever. I think it's how we live our life, and my main hope is that person also stands up whenever they see or hear of intolerance. So this would be, I think, the most important thing that anyone can do to honor the victims of the Holocaust and the victims of any genocide.
Does anyone have one more question you'd like to ask? And then Mr. Elbaum will also be staying after to answer some individual questions in San Francisco.
You managed to reconnect with the family, Catholic families, Israel or some righteous. And one more is, did you manage to know what happened to your family?
If what?
To your family.
Yeah.
If you know what happened to them, to your parent, to your father and your extended family.
The answer to question number one is no. The reason I didn't connect with any of the families that kept me was, first of all, I didn't know their names. And number two, after the war, after we moved to America, my mom defected. And as long as Poland was communist, it was not a good thing for her to try to connect with anyone in Poland. I met one person, and if we have time, can I answer that question? Right after the war ended, so Warsaw was still in ruins, as you saw on that. So there were people on the street selling goods. Very few stores had been, survived. So everything was being sold on the street. And my mom and I were walking, and all of a sudden she stops and she points ahead and she says to me, you see that woman sitting there, the blonde woman? You know who that is? I said, yes, that's Wawichanka. Wawichanka was a woman with whom she was in one of these places where I lived after we got out of the ghetto. And I remember her from that. I guess my memory was better than it is now. And my mom said she wanted to she said she wanted to blackmail me. She said, the one time I came in to see you, and for whatever reason, you didn't run up to me. And I said, my mom said, I didn't know why you didn't, and I don't remember that, but you didn't run up to me. And so we had a nice conversation, and I left. And the woman said to me at that time, you're clearly not his mother, because he would have greeted you much more warmly. Do you know his mother because you came to visit him? So therefore, you better tell his mother that if she's not here tomorrow with money, I'm going to report him to the Nazis. My mom came in that night and picked me up and took me somewhere else. So when we saw her, we approached her, and my mom said to her, you wanted to take my son to the police. Let's go right now. She said, no, it wasn't me. And so my mom turned to me and said, what's her name? Wabichanka. No, he's mistaken. Okay, we're going up to get some police. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Of course, my mom had no intention to do that. When we came back in 5 minutes, she was gone. But she's the only one that met. I have tried to find Leon through an organization, but no luck. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, we know what happened with my grandmother. Basically, the man who delivered the food to that bunker, this was a bunker that was being built in the ghetto, and they would have food for a couple of years. They could lock it up, running water, toilet facilities. But apparently, the man who delivered food to them after he was paid, he sold them out to the Nazis. So when I speak in Poland, there's an issue in Poland. There's a law that was passed a couple of years ago. I spoke to 1,200 people in Poland about 2 or 3 weeks after the law was passed. And I said to them, same way as I told you, I survived only because of Polish families risked their lives to hide me. At the same time, there was a Pole that betrayed my grandmother and sold her out to the Nazis. So yes, there was a lot of Poles that were heroic and saved Jews, but there were also Poles that, for whatever reason, betrayed them.
Thank you again for sharing your incredible story with us. I know you like to capture photos of your talks. So if you'd like to come over, sit on the bleachers, we can do a quick group photo, and then Dr. Elbaum will be here for a few minutes to answer any individual questions. Thank you so much to all of you for coming.